You mentioned the police role in this. What role did the police have to play?
Well, they have two primary roles. There's what's called a unified command. So you have fire assets, you have law enforcement assets, you'll have public works, for example. All these people are going to come together in the incident command system, and they form a unified command. So there's leaders of each group. They meet together to decide how they're going to address this. How are they going to address...
Before there is a fire, right? So this
Well, unfortunately, this started when the fire started. It should have been spun up days
with the
prior,
warnings.
with the warnings, so they would have everything in place. For example, in Pacific Palisades and Topanga Canyon, that area, they're mountainous roads, they're very narrow. You can't get fire engines through when everyone's parked on the shoulders of the road. That's always been a problem. So they have to issue parking restrictions because of the threat. So that clears out the road. You have to do early evacuations and get everybody out in a timely, orderly fashion, because everybody wants to evacuate at once is exactly what happened. Everyone jumped on the road and no one could move at all. I talked to someone who was stuck in a car in the Palisades, and they ended up walking away from their car because they couldn't go anywhere. And of course, the car burned down, their house burned down. That shouldn't have happened. And this is where the highway patrol is involved as well. Because when you clear out all the traffic to let people out, that means you got to clear it out all the way to the freeways. You make everything one direction only. If there's 2-lane roads, they become one direction, both lanes. And you got to get people moving out.
So the law enforcement had to do that, right?
They do the evacuations while the fire department, they do the firefighting. And that's the way it's supposed to work. Because law enforcement has a lot more bodies than fire does, about 5 times as many. But the fire people are devoted to putting out the fires, and they can do containment. They do their lines of defense, all those things they do, the aerial assault with the tankers and all that. They do that. Law enforcement does evacuations. Then they got to do the traffic control, make sure people don't go back into the area, prevent the looting, for example, that happened a lot afterwards. So there's a lot of activities that have to happen, and it requires leadership at the top to make sure you have the right people in the right place at the right time.
So you don't think the law enforcement was deployed at the right time?
Well, the problem is there's not enough law enforcement. This is where the Summer of Love of 2020, the defunding movement, hurt law enforcement. Between the LAPD and the sheriffs, they were over 3,000 personnel short. They're not there.
3,000 people short.
3,000, yes. Between the two, 3,000. So you have right now skeleton crews working patrol stations, and from there they're supposed to pull bodies to then go to the fires, which means now the patrol stations don't have people. So when you call 911, there's no one to send to the emergency area, so that you can see how thinly spread. And LA County, the Sheriff's Department is probably the most understaffed law enforcement agency in the entire nation. They have less than 0.9 deputies per 1,000 residents. LAPD, they have less than about 2.0 per 1,000 residents. The national average is 2.5. Metropolitan average across the entire nation is 3.8. So you're dealing with a huge metropolitan area of LA. You realize 0.9 and 2.0 is tragically small. Those are under normal circumstances. Now we have a massive event like this. You just don't have the man pool to provide personnel to keep the stations up and running and have personnel boots on the ground to address the fires. So the National Guard, got to call them up right away because they know they're short. They waited 4 days.
And did they have to get trained? We heard that they had to do some training as well.
No. National Guard, you can deploy them to traffic control points, to the perimeter, to maintain the security, the perimeter ingress and egress. And that frees up law enforcement to then go chase the looters and do all the police activities. And National Guard serves that purpose very well. And they can also do other things as well. But why they waited 4 days, I don't know. It was obvious even before it started. Order them up, because you know you don't have the personnel to initiate it, to begin with. So this is the planning part. This is the politicians at the top. But when the people are activated, they did a wonderful job, everyone. I mean, they've been working. Some people, unfortunately, were left in their posts for 24 hours straight with no relief. Imagine that.
No break, no relief.
Nothing. They're there for 24
Wow.
hours. And we heard the horror stories. And I talked to a young lady, and then they were in 12-hour shifts. So I talked to her 4 hours after the end of her 12-hour shift. She was still there. I talked to her sergeant an hour later. She was still there. That's now, do the math, that's now 17 hours. That person hasn't budged from that position, and they still have to go back to the command post. From the command post, she had to drive back to Compton Station to return her vehicle, go home the other direction. I think she lived in Glendale. At 6 in the morning, she had to be back at Compton to then go back there, which meant, when was she going to sleep? 2 hours at the most? So you got a lot of people out there like zombies. They're just bone tired, and that's lack of personnel.